News Talk 1400 KFRU is proud to present the KFRU Heritage Series. It's a one-hour perspective on the events and the people whose lives have contributed to the heritage of Boone County. Listen each Sunday at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. The KFRU Heritage Series. From News Talk 1400 KFRU.
The Heritage Series has covered a lot of topics while we've done this show in less than a year, but we're coming up on our year anniversary of doing this program. John Duncan's idea back in February of last year got us started, and we continue. I think we've got a unique guest this time. We have not talked much about military service, but we will throughout this interview on our Heritage Show. We welcome, I don't know the appropriate way of doing this, but it's Colonel Jim Coy, retired. Is that the official
correct.
way of doing it?
Yeah.
It's not retired colonel, it's Colonel Coy, retired. You served in what branch of the military?
I was in the U.S. Army.
For how many years?
26 years.
26 years. Where, for military people, and we have several that would be listening to this, they would want to know specifics. Where you were stationed at whatever else that a military man shares with another military man. What would you say would be the important things?
Well, I can sort of split my career in a couple of different areas. I guess I should begin by saying I served on active duty, I served in the National Guard, and I served in the reserve components. Part of my career, I served as a physician affiliated with hospital units. And the remaining part of my career, I was with the Army Special Forces or Army Special Operations. So the Special Operations tours were mostly out of Fort Bragg. I served with 5 different airborne units over a period of about half of my career out of Fort Bragg.
We think of special ops in certain ways. I think the movies sometimes romanticize this. When you speak of special operations, what comes to your mind that's important for people to know and to learn about special operations?
Most special operations units will, and every branch of the service has a special operations arm. They call them often the point or the tip of the spear. They're generally trained, as in the Navy SEALs, they're sea, air, and land. Army Special Forces, Green Berets, the groups that I were with are all paratroopers who then go on to do additional training and deploy all over the world for different scenarios.
Is Green Beret then a special ops person, but they could come by many names, or is Green Beret the special operation?
Special operations came into existence in about 1989. That term, special operations, now it was loosely used. Even in World War II, there were the first special services forces was a special operations unit, but Special Forces, the Green Berets, became really known best probably during the Vietnam conflict. After that time, for reasons almost politically and for reasons of promotion, Special Operations units became the command units of Special Forces units, Ranger units, SEAL units. So you have an Army Special Operations Command at Fort Bragg, and that's a 3-star general command. And below that would fall Special Forces, Ranger Command, and different airborne units. Same way in the Navy, and then you'll have United States Special Operations Command in Tampa, Florida.
We've heard of some of what Special Ops and SEAL teams have done over the last few years. When we're not involved in military operations in Afghanistan or Iraq or anywhere else, are special operations still doing some missions, or are they just on hold?
No, the special operations units are not just combat units. I mean, they are all combat units, but they're not used always in combat scenarios. You'll see, even in peacetime, you'll see special operations units serving all over the nations of the world, and they're basically a military and political bridge, and they help humanitarian services in that country, the government grow, hopefully toward a positive relationship with America. So the units are used all over, all the time, in many different scenarios. It's not just a special operations unit going into an area to hunt someone down.
No, it's interesting because I'm glad you said that, because most of the time we would think of these clandestine missions where they were going in and either grabbing someone and pulling them out or going in and eliminating somebody. But what you said is part of their mission also is to establish a relationship with the government. You think of that as peaceful as well as military purposes.
Correct.
Our guest is Colonel Jim Coy. He's retired. And we know him as, right now, you're hearing him talk about his special operations experiences that he's had. He's also an author. We'll talk about some of what he's written and how he has gone about putting together some books that really have contacted many individuals from great fame and also great importance to this country. And he's also a physician. He said he spent part of his time in the 30-plus years of service to the country as a doctor. But I'm curious now a little bit about you and your own life. You told me before we started the program you are from Kirksville originally.
Correct.
But when did you leave Kirksville, and where did you go from there?
I left Kirksville in the early 70s after graduating from college. I went to medical school, ended up in Oklahoma for a year, returned to the University of Missouri where I did my residency, then left. And when I came back to the university, I joined a reserve unit. My family was a military family, feeling like I should serve, so that was 1976. My two brothers were both senior NCOs in the Army, one Special Forces, one Artillery, and they just said, if you're going to be a physician in the military, don't just be a physician that puts on a green suit. First, be a soldier, and then the next thing is be the best physician you can be. So with the reserve, I requested to go into Special Forces training, was accepted, and went through all the operational courses that I got involved with.
How many doctors go into special operations?
Since the people I was with were... Many of the people were medical and were doctors, quite a few for me, but when you see them just on the street, less than 1%. When I went to jump school, of about 500 individuals, there were 5 physicians I started with and none completed except for myself. And that was pretty much the same way with air assault school. Very few physicians would complete the courses.
When you decided to go to med school, what did you have in mind then? Did you have in mind that you would use that training in a military role?
Not at all. I didn't really, as a young boy, I thought about joining the military. In fact, in high school, it would have appeared by my academic prowess that would have been the only thing that I might be able to do. I jokingly tell my kids, I periodically fail to meet my lofty goals of academic mediocrity. So I think as time evolved, it became apparent, I felt, sort of a God-directed call that I should go into medicine, even though many of my teachers would have probably thought that is not possible. And ended up in medicine, and then at one point in time felt a call because my family served. My family's been in America since about 1650, an English family, and they served in all the conflicts. We've had many family members from the Revolution War of 1812 to the French and Indian Wars, fighting for the British. At that time have served, have been wounded, have killed. I had an Uncle Daniel who was wounded and died at the Battle of New Orleans. So my great-grandfather served with the Union Army after moving from Kentucky. So long family heritage, just felt I should. Joined the reserve, and then that evolved into something that I would have never imagined with the Special Forces.
When you were, what was... med school like in the mid-'70s, right? Is that what you said? You were here
Correct.
In the mid-'70s going to med school?
Well, med school anywhere, anytime, I assume is very difficult. It was for me, as I said, academics was not my favorite thing, but you work hard, you spend a lot of hours in preparation, a lot of hours studying, you You eventually get out of school. You have to pass boards, and you do. Most people do a residency. By the time the 70s had come about, everybody was doing not just an internship, but residencies, 3 to 5 year residencies, and that was the period of time that I trained.
When we look at the hospital now, how much of the hospital that is there now was there when you were going through? And I'm talking about med school / university hospital.
Well, about half of it was when I came to the university to do my radiology residency. I would say that about half of what exists now, as you look at the structure, was there. It's similar in some ways, but you've had to see it evolve over the years, from the emergency section being placed out front and the helipads, and RUSC moving from where it once was, and
yeah.
So, yeah, a lot of changes.
Do you remember any particular people who influenced you at the med school? We'll move on to military here and the influences there, and so the influence you've had on some people with a military connection and the programs at the university. But who do you remember from your time there that were influential in your life?
Well, there are a couple of different ways I'll approach that. Also, I had, when I went to school at Northeast, or now Truman, and then I applied to the osteopathic college in Kirksville, Missouri. There was a fellow by the name of J. Stedman Denslow, who's since passed away. I am 66 now, so this is, for all of the young people listening, this is back when there were dinosaurs still traveling up in northeast Missouri. And so he impacted me in a powerful way. And then a physician by the name of Lear, who came to the university in radiology. As I developed an interest in radiology, he helped me get accepted in the programs here. And so those are two guys that I really don't even speak of. Maybe remember them once a year now in some way, or somebody will ask a question. But they impacted my life, certainly. I
got to tell you, I told you again before we started, I was born in Kirksville. I was born at KOH, so I guess the dinosaurs were probably roaming when I was there. At least their footprints were still visible. We're talking with Colonel Jim Coy, retired. Now, we'll get to your books after we take a break here in a few moments, but I'm curious. On the book, you're listed as Jimmy Dean Coy. That a lot of people would think of James Dean or Jimmy Dean. I mean, there are a lot of things there. Any reason, connection?
Well, the way that it evolved is I have a twin sister, and my sister was named after my mother, and I was named after my father. My father was Dean, so therefore Dean. My mother was Arlene. My sister, Jeannie Arlene, but my mother wanted another name rather than the same names that they had, so they had to find names, and Jeannie and Jimmy were two that were discussed, or Jimmy and Jeannie, and that's how they came up with that. But overall, my friends and military career, everybody just calls me Jim. My aunts, my sisters, and at times my brothers would call me Jimmy, but I just go by Jim.
Yeah. We'll take a break here in a couple of minutes. I want to finish up talking about this part of your life. When you were here at med school, you decided to use this as your continued home, your base? I mean, Columbia became your base for med school on?
Columbia, I came back to Columbia 30 years ago, and it really has worked well. I went back to the university. The two things, interestingly, that I said I will never, ever do is once you leave a university program, most residents say, I'll never go back to a university and work. And that was the way I felt as I left. But then I realized Columbia had a lot to offer and came back within a few years and stayed at the university. And then they asked some people in my department to go to the VA, but no one expressed an interest, and I thought, well, I would be interested. So I ended up at the VA, and it's just served me well because it allowed me time away to do things with the military. It allowed me to do research for the military, medical scientific research, and so I've had a blessed career.
Curious now, a couple of things you just said. One, I want to come back to what kind of research you did, what was the area, but I'm curious, why do residents always say, I'll never come back to a university?
I always say of residents, it's their job to be unhappy.
I think I understand
It's the
that.
job of residents to complain. They work long hours, and they have already put in many years. They put in 4 to 5 years of college and 4 to 5 years of medical school, and then 4 to 5 years of residency. It becomes 15 years very quickly, and they realize that they have invested a lot in everything that's going out, and they're not making much. Now, on the scale of things, a resident makes a pretty good salary compared to some people, so it's not like they're not paid anything. But they're not a particularly happy group because they want to learn more. They know they're going to have to take more tests. They need more time to study, and they find that they don't have as much time to study. They are doing just a lot of physical labor. It's not like picking up bricks and stacking bales, but they're doing a lot of physical and mental and labor that really it takes a toll.
I can understand that. I've heard stories of that. The research that you did when you were practicing and research on opportunity also, I guess you would be research and clinician. You were probably doing both as a physician for the VA.
What happened when I worked in emergency rooms for a period of about 4 years. So I worked as an emergency room physician in a number of different hospitals in North Missouri and in Illinois. With that background, primary care medicine, emergency medicine, and then a radiology residency. When I went into Special Forces has an interest in X-ray equipment for all kinds of different reasons. Some of the research I did, I'm not even at liberty to talk about with certain units that don't exist.
You can't talk about
right.
units that don't exist.
That's sort of, but one of the things I was asked to do was develop or help find a way to create lightweight X-rays. So Special Forces, Green Beret units could carry an X-ray machine with them, a processor, and film. So when they take care of their own patients who are injured, not necessarily in combat, but let's say on one mission I was running along the Amazon River. We were running a mission by ourselves along the Amazon River for a month, and I was using this 28-pound X-ray equipment with Polaroid film and a hand processor that weighed 2 pounds, and taking X-rays of people, jungle tribes in the Amazon, of where there'd never been X-rays. So we hooked them up to a portable generator, no hospitals or anything. We did the same thing with our own troops. Working at the VA, I was able to find a large pool of people who had been combat wounded who still had retained metal fragments, Vietnam AK-47 fragments, bullets from rifles. And we would X-ray them with this lightweight X-ray equipment. And then I used that in the Gulf War and used it in Honduras and used it in Panama and in Peru and took it to the Gulf and then went with the Marine Corps and the Navy to Turkey. So over a period of about 8 years, in fact, in one of the interesting trips, after I helped develop that equipment, the Chinese became interested. And so I went to China, but dressed as a civilian. And everybody I'm talking to, I'm showing cases of people who are wounded using this lightweight X-ray equipment, and they're obviously all military, but they're dressed in suits too. But me as a Special Forces American soldier talking to the Chinese People's Liberation Army and two physicians through an interpreter was sort of an interesting scenario. But they purchased many of those little lightweight.
And you help
X-ray
develop
machine.
those.
Yeah.
I'm guessing when you're out in the jungles of the Amazon, you're not wearing a lead apron there to
In fact,
protect
we did
them.
carry lead aprons.
You did? Man, those things are another 20
but
or 30
we
or
weren't
50.
wearing them all the time.
Yeah, but I mean, just to haul them and take them through there.
Yeah.
We'll take a break. We're going to come back and continue our discussion. It's a interesting one on the Heritage Show today. We're talking with Colonel Jim Coy, retired. He's an author, as you've heard. He's a physician. He's had many experiences. Also has lived in Colombia for the last 30 years and talked a little while ago about his experiences at the med school. And we'll come back and visit more with him. Stay with us. This is the KFRU Heritage Show.
More coming up on News Talk 1400, KFRU. This is the KFRU Heritage Series.
We're continuing on our discussion on the Heritage Show today on KFRU with Colonel Jim Coy, retired, author of several books that we're going to talk about in this segment. But I'm curious as to, there are probably some people that address you as Dr. Coy or Colonel Coy. In your mind, having achieved through hard work and dedication and commitment both of those titles, how do they sound differently to you, if at all?
You know, I speak at a number of different locations, really internationally, and people will always ask me, now, how do we introduce you? Do we call you Colonel, or do we call you Doctor? Or do we say you're an author? And I just say, my parents called me Jim, so just call me Jim. If I'm in a military circumstance, a situation, I'm going to be introduced, I would prefer to be called Colonel.
Mm-hmm.
If the same thing, if I'm in a medical circumstance or situation, probably Doctor is appropriate. But I have no problem with people just saying, hey, Jim.
I think any of the places you visited, and you mentioned at the end of our last segment, would be interesting to explore. But I want to go to the Amazon for just a second. What in the world were you doing at the Amazon for a month?
We were running a humanitarian mission along the Amazon River. So we would be with the Peruvian Navy. They would drop us off along the Amazon River, and we would go into villages and do medical cases. It was a purely medical mission, although many of us were special operations, special forces soldiers, and my job on that mission specifically was as people would find people that they thought needed medical x-rays. Tuberculosis is a disease that is rampant in some areas of the world. So rather than deal with people who are coughing up blood, they'd like to know, does this person have active tuberculosis? We'd take a chest film on them and find out if they did. There is one of the few remaining leprosariums in the world is in Peru. So we happened along this leprosarium, spent a day there, and I photographed extremities of people who had damage secondary to leprosy. So it was one of the most interesting medical trips that I've ever been on, because I saw diseases that you only see pictures of in books, even medical books. Some of the photographs that I took and x-rays that I took on that mission, people who are teaching at the med school have never seen some of the things we saw.
How often is it that a medical, even if it's medical, but it was still connected to the military, teams up with something like you said, the Peruvian Navy dropped us off there? I would imagine that there are many cooperative efforts, many times probably in peacetime as well as in wartime, between countries that are allies that we don't even know about.
There are absolutely hundreds of those types of missions going on every day in hundreds of different nations across the world. I think and when I deployed to Honduras, to Panama, to Peru, to Israel, I've been to Mongolia and China, and just on and on and on. So, is
this when you sit here and tell us that? Does that seem? I mean, you say it so matter-of-factly. It's like, oh, that's just part of what I've done in my life. But for many of us, we listen to that and say, "Holy cow, that is amazing!" All the places you've been.
Yeah. I just have to say I was blessed. As I look at it by a faith standard and a spiritual standard, I said, God has been faithful to me. and has blessed me. He took, as I've indicated before, not a particularly bright young fellow and allowed him to do some things that you would not get to do in just an ordinary career or life. But I've been willing to acknowledge that I believe that it was God being faithful to me that allowed me to do that.
Do you have that faith going way back, or is this something that came along in your journey?
I grew up in a family that had a faith, and they tried to pass that faith on to all their children as those people who would have a faith. But as I had indicated, there was a period of time that it seemed to me that almost every decision that I made in my life was the wrong decision. I would call that my years of being a pagan. But what drove me back toward a faith was a number of years ago, I had a sore in my mouth, and that sore was, in fact, a malignancy, and it was operated and considered cured, and then had a reoccurrence of a malignancy, and then they couldn't get it all and was radiated, and then a number of years later had a reoccurrence of another malignancy where they said, well, if we remove some bone in your face, maybe we can cure this. And so over the course of time, I think that I was driven back to a faith. I often will tell people as I introduce myself, I'll say, I've had 5 biopsies, 4 major surgeries, and 2 months of radiation therapy over a 10-year period to make me this ugly. And then I say it usually to the men. My wife says I can't say it to the ladies, but to the men in the group, then I just say to them, and I say, well, now, what is your excuse?
We're talking with Colonel Jim Coy. One of your business cards here, and this picks up on what you were just talking about. It says, faith in the foxhole, hope on the home front to the ends of the earth. And this is with Military Ministry, a division of Campus Crusade for Christ International. I'm familiar with some of Campus Crusade for Christ. I had no idea they had a military ministry that was a part of that.
Yeah, the military ministry, in fact, a lot of the major ministries across the nations of the world probably have developed a military ministry arm. If you would take a look at the Navigators or different large ministries, if you would look at Billy Graham's ministry, they probably have a military-specific group of people that try to deal with military issues and those in the military, because it's a large group of people who may or may not need a faith.
Did you see examples of faith in the foxhole? I mean, you're talking about, and you were talking about what you went through, and you're talking about your religion and your faith and what's been important to you and your health and the issues that have occurred there and how you've dealt with that. But I'm thinking there are a lot of places that people serving in the military, I just wonder how scared or calm you were within some of the situations that you faced.
Well, the old statement about there are no atheists in foxholes is an absolute truism. It is correct. There are many people who have no faith, many people who are pagan who serve in the military, and they may call themselves atheists or agnostics, but in times of stress and in times where you fear that you may even lose your life, you want to believe, at least in the possibility that there is something greater, something more important, and people will reach out to faith. And I found that true in the Medal of Honor book, the book Valor, and in the POW book that I wrote, that many people, they may, none of these guys go to seminary.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they do things that would be just the opposite of what you would hope your seminary graduate would do, but they express the possibility that at this point in time, and it changed my life, and this circumstance, this difficulty, left me with the possibility that faith is important.
When you wrote these books, and you've been kind enough to bring Prisoners of Hope, A Gathering of Eagles, Book 3, you mentioned Valor a moment ago. Describe the books for listeners.
Well, the 3 books, the first book that I did was just referred to as A Gathering of Eagles, and I was a full colonel, and the rank that you wear on your epaulet, on your shoulder, is an eagle. And I was asked by the University of Missouri a number of years ago, about 1995, to address graduating cadets and midshipmen with the university about leadership. And I thought, I can talk about leadership. I can tell some jokes and people will laugh. I can tell some sad stories and people will cry. I can gather a whole group of emotions talking about different things in my leadership over the years. But as I thought about preparing that talk, I thought I'd like to hear from Medal of Honor recipients because they're the bravest of the brave, our nation's highest award for valor. I'd like to hear from some admirals and generals, people like Norman Schwarzkopf, Colin Powell. I'd like to hear from some ex-POWs because they endured more for freedom than anyone. And then I thought I'd like to hear from a few politicians, a few. And then I'd like to hear from some leaders in religion to balance it out. And so I wrote 40 men. 35 men wrote back and said, this is the advice I would give to the cadets and midshipmen at the University of Missouri.
So you asked them to say, here is what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be speaking to these.
And what Billy Graham, what is the advice that you would offer? And Billy Graham would say something to the effect of, read your Bible daily and study the Word of God. Don't try to get ahead of God. God's plan's perfect for your life. And Norm Schwarzkopf would say, success is not what you get for yourself, it's what you do for other people. And it's sort of a paradigm shift of the American dream. You mean it's not about earned degrees or the money you make or the clothes you wear, the car you drive? No, it's not. Success is what you do for other people, is what Norm Schwarzkopf would say. So with that, it evolved the first book, and then the first book went to a second edition. And again, a gathering of eagles, and then the Medal of Honor recipients from the first book. And this all evolved out of this speech or talk at the University of Missouri. And 3 years after that, I had finished the first book. And then we did Valor because the Medal of Honor recipients wanted their own book. And then the POWs saw Valor, and they said, well, we'd like that. In fact, a couple of the POWs were also Medal of Honor recipients, so they said, we'd like to have a POW book. And then DVDs were created interviewing the men that ring the cover of each one of those books. So there are DVDs out there, Valor and Prisoners of Hope. And then I started on a faith series, and I'm just finishing the last of the faith series books now, and that'll be a devotional for the military.
Are the faith series then, they are devotionals? You're coming up with those ideas?
Yeah, the faith series, what I did, I lead a men's group every Wednesday morning in Columbia. It's called Men Without Fear, and that comes from an experience I had from the Gulf War. Men Without Fear. It's the story of Gideon, the 7th book of the Bible, the 7th chapter, the 7th verse. By these 300 men will I save Israel. 777. That was assigned to me as my number if I was captured as a POW in the first Gulf War. If I was a POW, my assigned number was 777. So if Special Operations Unit came in, and I'm now old, I look like I do now, and they can't recognize me 22 years ago now, if they couldn't recognize me, and they would say, well, we're not sure you are who you say you are. In your case, I thought that'd be pretty tough. In my case, people would recognize me. But the scenario was, what is the number you'd give them? You'd give them the number 777. Wow. So that spiritually became important to me. And
we'll wrap up this segment with one final question. I want to go back to what you're talking about. You talked to religious leaders, you talked to a Medal of Honor winners and prisoners of war. You said, and a few politicians. Mm-hmm. Can you remember one politician and what that politician might have said as his advice?
Yeah, without getting into my my political affiliations, and they have certainly changed, and I can tell some jokes about it to be humorous. But there is a fellow by the name of Carper, and he is from Delaware. And when I first met him, he was, in fact, a governor. but he later became a senator. In fact, is still a senator. His advice for life is this, and if everybody would live this piece of advice, even though I don't particularly like maybe political advice, his advice would be this: find someone who needs help and then help them. I mean, that's amazing. If everyone would look for somebody who needed help and then actually help them, it's sort of the golden rule.
Sort of, but not quite.
But
because
quite.
It's not, you're just seeing other needs that you may have not experienced and responding to those. It's pretty simple, but hard, isn't it?
Yeah.
We'll come back after this final break and continue our visit and wrap it up with our guest on the Heritage Show this week. This is News Talk 1400 KFRU.
More coming up on News Talk 1400 KFRU. This is the KFRU Heritage Series.
We have one final segment left of our visit that has gone very quickly with Colonel Jim Coy, retired, also a physician. We've covered a lot of ground in our first two segments, and we have a short segment left to go. And here we are almost to the end of this time, and I haven't asked you this question yet, which I will with some reservation. When we watch MASH, you've said you've been a physician in the emergency rooms in this country, but also on the battlefield. How close were some of the situations that you have seen to what is portrayed either in the movies or on television?
Well, there are pieces to many movies, military movies, that are correct, and then there are pieces to many of those movies that are not correct. The part of Klinger, I certainly never had any experience of people like that. I've certainly seen some peculiar things happen in the military, and in combat, you know, it's the proverbial, there are times of sheer boredom and there are times of just sheer terror. Depending upon how close you are to the scenario, there is one of the statements that was once made in MASH, the first rule of war is young men have to die, and the second rule of war is you can't change rule number one. And that is a truth. War is a horrible business, but we have to have somebody who's willing to die for freedom. We have to have people who are willing to die for freedom, because it is a profoundly important gift that we've been given.
It seems to me like a physician and someone in the military has to get trained to the point where just instinct takes over at certain times. You have to think. I'm not saying it's not that, but I'm saying that you just react to situations.
Yeah, one of the phrases that is often used is train to fight and fight to train, which means you train to fight, and even if they won't give you the money to learn how to do it, you fight for that right to learn how to do it. You fight the political arm or whoever it might be, that they will offer you the training, even if it costs money, to do what it is you have to do.
Do you still speak to some of the graduates of the University of Missouri who are going out and serving the country?
Yeah, I lead a study on Fridays, a Valor study, where we use advice from the Valor book, and then we tie in different scenarios on leadership. So, yeah.
Are they, when you look at they were men and women now, I would guess, that are taking your class, and from what study you have done of military history, from what you have served around, do you still see brave young men and women who are committed to this country in the way that's important?
Absolutely. Every generation seems to step up to the plate, and there are many good young men and women. I heard a pastor's wife once say, I don't want my children serving in the military. And I thought, well, whose children do you want to serve in the military? That's not right. It really is a privilege to serve in the military. It may put your child in harm's way, but it is a privilege to serve the nation in uniform. For me as a believer, it's a privilege to have served the nation in uniform, in harm's way with the Special Forces unit. But it was also a privilege to be able to serve the nation and to serve my faith, to serve God.
I know you may or may not have come prepared to do this, but where are your books available? How are people put in touch with what you've written?
You can go to Amazon and get them. You can go to any local bookstore or a Christian bookstore and just ask them. People can get up with me by going to the web address of agatheringofeagles.com. So just www.agatheringofeagles.com, and I think my email address is listed there also.
We should just again refresh people's memory. Maybe they have forgotten, or maybe they have just joined us towards the end of our program. A Gathering of Eagles refers to?
A Gathering of Eagles refers to the group of books, the leadership books on leadership, courage, and hope. And
goes back to you're talking about the Eagles also that were on your sleeve when you were serving. The last, what did it feel like when you knew that you were retiring, you were leaving military service?
Most of the time when you retire, you're ready to do so. I used to fly with aviators as a flight surgeon, people who had been aviators in Vietnam. I always felt very comfortable with those guys because many of them had been shot down 2 or 3 times. And if you have to go down in a helicopter, you don't want to do it with a young pilot. You want to do it with someone who has experience. And what would happen on a given day, they would say, I just don't want to do this anymore. I think I'm going to retire. And your response to them would be, but you're so good at this. Why would you do that? Most of us who have done that for a period of time, we're ready to retire when it happens. There are some people in Special Force, Special Operations, the adrenaline junkies, guys who live on the edge. Some of them can never draw away from it. They always want to. In fact, I've known guys who have been in who are there every time something happens somewhere. They are there. They're just adrenaline junkies. But most people find a time it's appropriate not to do those things anymore.
I'll tell you, it's been a privilege to talk to you. Thank you for sharing your stories. I've really been blessed by having the opportunity to hear your stories and hear your outlook on life. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Glad to do it.
It's the Heritage Show. Feedback always welcomed at david.lyle. Again, my last name with an I in it, L-I-L-E, david.lyle@cumulus.com. You can give feedback or suggestions for future Heritage shows. Our guest this week has been Colonel Jim Coy, retired. This is News Talk 1400 KFRU.
You've been listening to the KFRU Heritage Series, celebrating our history and heritage of Columbia and Boone County. Listen each Sunday at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. The KFRU Heritage Series. From News Talk 1400, KFRU, Columbia.